For most people, history changes slowly. But in the late 1940s, the world shifted in an instant. The mushroom clouds over Japan didn't just end a war, they opened a door to an era where one mistake could annihilate civilization. And in that fragile moment, America realized it needed something it didn't yet have, a machine capable of carrying the weight of the free world on its wings. That machine would become the B-52 Stratofortress. But its road from idea to reality began in a way no one expected. With a desperate deadline, a hotel room, and a handful of engineers racing against the future. After World War II, the United States watched the Soviet Union expand its influence at alarming speed. Stalin now commanded not only vast armies, but the plans, and soon the weapons, to build nuclear bombs. The Strategic Air Command, SAC, newly formed under General Curtis LeMay, knew what was coming. If a third world war erupted, survival would depend on reaching targets deep inside the Soviet Union before their missiles reached us. But America had a problem. There was no aircraft capable of doing that. The bombers of World War II, giants like the B-29 and B-36, simply lacked the speed, range, and altitude needed in the nuclear age. SAC demanded something new. A jet-powered intercontinental bomber that could fly farther, faster, and carry more destructive power than anything ever built. In October 1948, hope arrived in Dayton, Ohio. Colonel Henry Pete Worden of the Wright Air Development Center called a meeting with Boeing. The engineers arrived proudly carrying a stack of drawings for a large turboprop bomber. Worden glanced at the papers, pushed them aside, and made a demand that stunned the room. "Design me a jet bomber," he said, "and bring me the prototype layout in 2 days." 2 days to create the backbone of America's nuclear strike force. 2 days to redraw the future. With no time to return to Seattle, the Boeing engineers retreated to the Van Cleve Hotel, a modest downtown building whose 7th floor would soon become the birthplace of legend. They spread papers across a round wooden table, slept on couches, and worked through the night fueled by coffee and sheer determination. They knew failure was not an option. Using aerodynamic data from earlier experimental models, they began stretching wings, recalculating loads, and testing engine placements. Meanwhile, Boeing aerodynamicist George Scher quietly slipped out to buy the largest piece of balsa wood he could find. While others scribbled equations, he sat in a corner carving a scale model by hand, feeling the airflow in his fingers, shaping the jet that would dominate the skies. By Sunday afternoon, the transformation was complete. The design now featured 8 turbojet engines arranged in 4 pods, a massive 185-foot swept wing, a speed of nearly 500 knots, enough range to cross oceans, enough payload to carry the most powerful weapons on Earth. On Monday morning, the engineers marched back into Worden's office and placed their work on his desk. He studied it for a long moment, nodded once, and said the words that would shape the next century: "Proceed." 3 months later, the Air Force officially approved the project. By early 1949, Boeing's factories in Seattle roared to life. Wind tunnels ran day and night, refining the wing shape that would become iconic. Engineers tested everything: engine placement, control surfaces, fuel flow, inch by inch, year after year. On April 15, 1951, the first prototype rolled out, silver-skinned, wide-winged, unlike anything the world had ever seen. They called it the YB-52. Test pilot Tex Johnston would later say, "We knew we had a winner before it ever left the ground." And on its maiden flight, when the plane lifted gently off the runway and vanished into the horizon, the engineers watching at Boeing Field felt something deeper than pride. They felt history turn. It had taken 7 years from the first Air Force request to that moment. 7 years of calculations, redesigns, wind tunnels, failures, and breakthroughs. 7 years to build a bomber that would eventually fly longer, farther, and harder than any combat aircraft in history. But for now, the B-52 was still just a promising newcomer. Its true destiny, and the role it would play in the most dangerous era humanity had ever faced, was only beginning to unfold. It began with a sound, a rising metallic wail that could freeze the blood of any man who had ever lived with it. In the late 1950s, thousands of airmen slept in their bunks inside long, windowless alert facilities across America. And when the klaxon screamed, they never knew whether it meant another drill or the end of the world. This was the era when the B-52 became more than an aircraft. It became a shield, a living constant presence in the sky, built to convince the Soviet Union that any attack would unleash a counterstrike too devastating to imagine. By 1957, the Cold War had transformed into a silent, relentless contest of endurance. The Soviet Union now possessed atomic and hydrogen bombs, long-range bombers, and the will to use them if the balance ever tipped in their favor. The United States needed a force always ready, never asleep, capable of launching within minutes or already airborne when danger came. Thus was born Operation Chrome Dome, perhaps the most extraordinary and dangerous mission ever assigned to a peacetime air force. 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, at least a dozen B-52s loaded with thermonuclear weapons patrolled the skies. These were not training flights. These jet giants, some weighing more than 200 tons, carried bombs more powerful than anything dropped in World War II by orders of magnitude. Each B-52 might be carrying the equivalent of thousands of Hiroshimas slung beneath its wrinkled, fuel-laden wings. Crews lived under constant pressure. A single alert shift could last 7 days, and during that week they might be woken at any hour, sprinting into freezing darkness toward aircraft already fueled, armed, and ticking like enormous mechanical hearts. Every man on board knew his target. Every man knew that once he crossed a certain line in the sky, there would be no turning back. Inside the cockpit, the atmosphere was tense but disciplined. Above the pilots sat the navigator and radar bombardier, men who spent hours hunched over glowing scopes in dim light while the aircraft vibrated around them. Behind them, the electronic warfare officer monitored signals that might spell life or death. At the very back, the tail gunner sat alone, surrounded by steel and darkness, responsible for the last line of defense. But the greatest hardships came from the missions themselves. A typical Chrome Dome flight lasted 20 to 26 hours, pushing human endurance to its limit. At high altitudes, temperatures could drop to 55 degrees Celsius. Moisture evaporated quickly. Men often lost 5 to 10 pounds of water during a single mission. Sleep, when possible, came on narrow folding beds, the drone of engines a constant reminder of the responsibility on their shoulders. And then there was the refueling, a maneuver as delicate as surgery, yet carried out in turbulence, darkness, or blinding cloud. Imagine guiding a massive bomber to within 20 feet of another aircraft while flying at hundreds of miles per hour, hoping that a pocket of rough air didn't slam the two giants together. Pilots often emerge drenched in sweat, their bodies shaking from the tension. Yet all of this, the fatigue, the danger, the endless vigilance, served one purpose: deterrence. SAC, under the iron leadership of General Curtis LeMay, operated on a chillingly simple principle: make the Soviet Union fear the consequences of aggression more than they desire victory. LeMay drilled his crews mercilessly. He demanded perfection, perfect navigation, perfect bombing accuracy, perfect execution of nuclear protocols. He inspected uniforms, checked living quarters, reviewed performance records personally. He wanted no doubt, not in Washington, not in Moscow, that America's nuclear force was ready every hour of every day. And it worked. Intelligence later revealed that Soviet military planners constantly calculated whether they could strike first. Their conclusion, repeated for years, was always the same: not today. Because somewhere above the clouds, a B-52 was waiting. Inside each aircraft, behind locked panels, were the classified go codes. If received and authenticated, they meant only one thing: the unthinkable had happened. Every man who served these missions had rehearsed the moment countless times. The navigator would break open sealed packets. Two crew members would cross-check letter sequences. If they matched the message from SAC headquarters, the bomber would turn toward its target, knowing the world below was already engulfed in nuclear fire. Most crews made plans with their families. Wives knew where to drive, what to pack, how many minutes they had before shockwaves or fallout reached the base. Children, too young to understand, learned escape routes as if preparing for a storm. This was life beneath the shadow of the B-52, a mixture of pride, fear, exhaustion, and purpose. Accidents happened, planes collided during refueling, engines failed. Some crews never came home. But the B-52 endured, and with it, the uneasy peace it guarded. To many veterans, the Cold War wasn't cold at all. It was years of sleepless nights, red alert sirens, and the knowledge that humanity's survival depended on tired men inside a vibrating steel fuselage cruising above the Arctic Circle in total silence. And yet, for all the tension, for all the danger, the system held. Chrome Dome flights circled the planet for more than a decade, a nuclear shield that never rested. The B-52 had become the airborne embodiment of American resolve, a machine built not only to wage war, but to prevent it, a weapon so formidable and so reliable that its very existence may have stopped World War III before it could begin. But this was only the midpoint of its story. The day would come when the Stratofortress would leave its cold, silent patrols and enter real combat, not in Europe, but in the jungles of Southeast Asia, where its thunder would reshape the battlefield and shake the world. It began, as disasters often do, with routine. A calm sky, a practice maneuver, a mission flown hundreds of times before. But on January 17th, 1966, routine shattered at 3,500 feet above the coast of Spain, when a B-52 and its KC-135 tanker met in a ball of fire that lit the morning sky. 4 hydrogen bombs fell toward Earth, and for a few terrifying hours the world held its breath. This was the hidden face of the Cold War, not the speeches or maps or treaties, but the moments when a single mistake could have erased a continent. Throughout the 1960s, B-52s armed with thermonuclear weapons patrolled the air day and night under Operation Chrome Dome. It was an astonishing display of readiness, but also an extraordinary gamble. These bombers were flying refueling maneuvers over oceans, continents, and foreign airspace while carrying bombs capable of ending human civilization. And although safety systems were elaborate and redundant, machines fail, weather changes, human beings make mistakes. The first major warning came near Palomares, Spain. During a standard refueling, the B-52 approached the tanker too steeply. In seconds, the two aircraft collided. The tanker erupted in flames. The bomber broke apart. Bomb casings tumbled toward the Mediterranean, one sinking into dark waters where U.S. Navy submarines hunted for it for months. It was eventually found, intact, its safety mechanisms holding, but the incident terrified governments around the world. Yet it was not the last. 2 years later, in 1968, another nuclear-armed B-52 crashed near Thule Air Base in Greenland. The explosion scattered debris over ice and frozen sea, igniting a massive international cleanup effort that involved thousands of personnel working in sub-zero conditions. The political fallout was as dangerous as the physical one. Denmark and other nations grew increasingly alarmed that American bombers carrying nuclear weapons were routinely flying over their territories without consent. The pressure mounted. The risks, long accepted as necessary, now looked intolerable. Behind the scenes, SAC commanders debated what had once been unthinkable: ending continuous airborne nuclear patrols. The introduction of intercontinental ballistic missiles and nuclear submarines, weapons that didn't require 26-hour flights or mid-air refueling, gave the United States new layers of retaliatory security. So in late 1968, Chrome Dome was quietly shut down. For the crews who had flown those dangerous circuits, it felt like the end of an era, a long, sleepless vigil finally complete. But while policies shifted, the danger had not fully passed. Because the B-52 was still on alert, still fueled, still armed, and still tethered to the razor-thin line between peace and annihilation. There were false alarms, moments when radar screens lit up with phantom attacks, or when a computer glitch suggested incoming Soviet bombers. Air crews rushed to their aircraft in the freezing dark, adrenaline surging as they waited for the definitive message that separated a drill from the apocalypse. More than one veteran later admitted that in those moments, standing under the roar of 8 idling engines, he believed he might be witnessing the end of civilization. The most haunting stories came from the men who were there, men who saw strange lights over the Atlantic and thought nuclear war had begun, men who heard a genuine launch alert during the night and sprinted for their planes, convinced their families were already lost. One recalled sitting in the cockpit as the radios crackled with partial codes, unable to tell if they were errors or the start of World War III. Another remembered the icy silence inside the aircraft when a full moon broke through the clouds and was mistaken for the flash of a distant detonation. In that moment, he said, "I felt older than I do today." These near catastrophes exposed how fragile peace truly was. Massive systems designed to prevent war sometimes threatened to trigger it. It became clear that not every crisis would come from an enemy. Some would come from a faulty radar, a tired technician, a frozen sensor, or a struggling refueling boom. Yet through all the mishaps, accidents, and false alarms, one truth remained constant. The professionalism of the crews flying the B-52 held the system together. They lived with fear, but did not surrender to it. They trained endlessly, prepared relentlessly, and accepted burdens few civilians ever imagined. For them, deterrence wasn't an abstract idea. It was a man strapped into an ejection seat at 40,000 feet, carrying weapons powerful enough to burn cities from the earth, hoping every hour that he would never receive the code that unleashed them. These were the years when the world came closest to disaster without ever crossing the brink. The B-52 was both a guardian and a reminder, a symbol of protection, but also of how thin the line between safety and catastrophe could be. And soon, after decades of silent patrols, that line would shift again. The next chapter in the B-52's story would not unfold over the Arctic, but over the jungles of Southeast Asia, where the aircraft would finally enter the crucible of full-scale war. ChatGPT Skazal, they called them Big Belly missions, a name that sounded almost comical until you saw what a fully loaded B-52D looked like. Its bomb bay groaned under the weight of 84 iron bombs. Another 24 hung under its wings. One aircraft, in a single pass, could erase a patch of jungle the size of a small town. And in 1965, as the conflict in Vietnam escalated, that was exactly what the United States asked it to do. For the first time in its life, the B-52 was leaving the cold, silent skies of nuclear deterrence and entering a real shooting war. The shift was dramatic. In Europe and the Arctic, the The Stratofortress had been a ghost, never fired upon, never challenged. In Southeast Asia, it would face missiles, fighters, and thunderstorms powerful enough to rip its giant wings apart. Operation Rolling Thunder was the beginning. President Lyndon Johnson authorized sustained bombing of North Vietnam, and the Air Force needed a platform capable of delivering massive, continuous firepower. Nothing matched the B-52's capacity. Engineers rushed to modify the D models, ripping out unnecessary hardware, reinforcing mounts, and transforming the aircraft into a machine built for saturation bombing. When the upgrades were complete, each big-belly B-52 could carry more explosive force than an entire World War II bomber group. But the true test came in the air. A B-52 is enormous, a flying barn with bright reflective skin and a radar signature you could spot from another continent. North Vietnamese radar operators joked that the Stratofortress didn't appear on their screens. It arrived. Every mission into hostile territory meant entering a sky filled with Soviet-designed SA-2 surface-to-air missiles, each capable of blasting the bomber apart at 60,000 feet. Electronic warfare officers worked frantically, jamming radars, dispensing chaff, listening for lock-on tones that signaled a missile rising from the jungle below. Crews later recalled seas of missile trails, white streaks slicing upward like spears aimed at the heart of the formation. Some nights, there were so many SAM launches that the sky seemed to shimmer. The danger grew constantly. MiG-21 fighters, guided by ground controllers, learned to shadow B-52 formations, feeding altitude and speed data to missile sites. Their goal wasn't to shoot down the bombers directly, it was to make SAM batteries more accurate. Air crews called them silent hunters, predators that stalked but didn't strike. Despite the threat, B-52s hammered supply depots, troop concentrations, and infiltration routes with devastating effect. When the aircraft struck, the earth shook. Infantrymen on the ground described the shockwaves as walking across the soil. In North Vietnam, survivors emerged from craters in a daze, believing they had been hit by an earthquake. By 1972, diplomacy had failed and the war dragged on. North Vietnamese negotiators hardened their position, convinced America was losing the will to continue. In response, Washington ordered a final decisive blow, Operation Linebacker II, a concentrated bombing campaign designed to break resistance and force a settlement. Every B-52 crew remembers where they were when the briefing doors closed on December 18th. They were told to prepare for 11 days of strikes on the most heavily defended city in the world. Hanoi bristled with SAMs, radar stations, anti-aircraft guns, and MiG bases. Many men in the audience understood instantly. Not all of them would return. The first nights were brutal. The B-52s flew predictable routes, a mistake born of haste and overconfidence. North Vietnamese missile crews, already experienced, quickly learned the bombers' approach patterns. On the third night, the sky over Hanoi became a slaughterhouse. 6 B-52s were shot down in a single evening. Crews ejected into jungle and city streets lit by burning wreckage. Families at home stared at empty phones, praying they would not hear a knock on the door. Among the survivors was Captain John Ewell. His aircraft was struck twice by SAMs. Explosions that tore open the fuselage, blew out the cockpit windows, and set the wings ablaze. He fought the controls, trying to keep the aircraft level long enough for his men to escape. The decompression was so violent that the roar inside the cockpit drowned out his own voice. When he finally triggered the bailout lights, each crewman punched out into the freezing night. Ewell was captured and held in the infamous Hanoi Hilton, only to experience the horror of lying in a prison cell while B-52s bombed the city around him. Yet despite the losses, despite the terror, the missions continued. and adapted. Routes changed, tactics shifted, electronic warfare tightened, and slowly, painfully, the casualty rate fell. The Stratofortress proved it could survive even the densest air defenses ever assembled. By the end of Linebacker II, B-52s had flown more than 700 sorties over North Vietnam, dropping 15,000 tons of ordnance. They destroyed airfields, communication centers, fuel depots, and electrical power plants. In Hanoi, officials admitted privately that continued strikes would cripple their ability to wage war. On January 15th, negotiations resumed in Paris. Days later, a ceasefire agreement was signed, but victory came at a terrible cost. 15 B-52s had been lost. 92 airmen had gone down. Some died instantly. Others were captured. Families waited for months, some for years, for confirmation of their fate. And yet, for all the suffering and sacrifice, the B-52's legacy in Vietnam became undeniable. It was a machine that could absorb unimaginable punishment, deliver overwhelming firepower, and alter the course of a conflict by sheer presence. The Cold War had trained the B-52 for a war that, thankfully, never came. Vietnam taught it how to actually fight one, and as the last American troops left Southeast Asia, no one imagined that this aircraft, battered, aging, written off by some as a relic, was only halfway through its story. Decades later, it would rise again into new conflicts, proving that even in a rapidly changing world, the Stratofortress still had battles left to win. By the time the Vietnam War ended, the B-52 was already a veteran, scarred, weathered, and respected by friend and foe alike. Most aircraft retire long before reaching such age. But the Stratofortress was never most aircraft. Instead of fading into museums after Southeast Asia, it entered a second life, then a third, and eventually something even rarer, a legacy that outlives the world it was built for. When the 1980s arrived, the Cold War was again heating up. The Soviet Union was fielding new missiles, new bombers, and new doctrines. Many believed the B-52 would finally be replaced by more advanced aircraft like the sleek B-1B or the stealthy B-2 Spirit. But the planners at the Pentagon soon discovered an uncomfortable truth. Nothing in the American arsenal could match the B-52's combination of range, payload, reliability, and cost. The old giant was too useful to let go. So instead of retiring it, the Air Force transformed it. The upgrades came constantly. New avionics replaced analog dials. Digital navigation systems replaced starlight sextants. Conventional bomb racks gave way to racks for cruise missiles, weapons that could fly hundreds of miles on their own. For the first time in history, a bomber built to deliver free-fall hydrogen bombs became a platform for precision-guided strikes, able to hit within meters of its target. In 1991, when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, the world saw just how far the B-52 had come. During Operation Desert Storm, the aircraft flew some of the longest combat missions ever recorded. One sortie lasted more than 35 hours, flying from Louisiana to Iraq, unleashing waves of conventionally armed cruise missiles, then returning home in a single continuous flight. No other bomber could have done it. No other aircraft had the endurance, the stability, or the brute fuel capacity to remain effective hour after hour, continent after continent. But the real turning point came a decade later. On the morning of September 11, 2001, the world watched in shock as the towers fell. Within hours, B-52s at bases across America were placed on alert. Before the year ended, they were once again flying into combat, this time against terrorist networks hidden in the mountains and caves of Afghanistan. For a bomber designed in the 1940s, the missions of the 21st century seemed almost unimaginable. Yet the B-52 adapted with astonishing ease. Instead of nuclear weapons, it carried precision-guided JDAM bombs that struck within 13 meters of their targets. Instead of mass carpet bombing, it supported special operations teams on horseback and foot patrols, dropping ordnance only meters ahead of friendly forces. Crews watched in real time through remotely relayed signals as troops on the ground designated targets with laser pointers. It was no longer simply a hammer. It had become a scalpel. One story became legendary. An Air Force staff sergeant, pinned down by Taliban fighters, made a desperate Mayday call. A B-52 orbiting nearby received his coordinates. Within 8 minutes, it released a pattern of wind-corrected munitions that tore into enemy positions. Between 250 and 300 hostile fighters were eliminated, and the trapped team escaped. The sergeant later said the sound of the B-52 overhead was the most beautiful thunder I ever heard. By now, the aircraft was older than many of the pilots flying it, but age did not slow it down. Through the 2000s and 2010s, the B-52 served in Iraq, Syria, and Afghanistan, using modern weapons that its original designers could never have imagined. It dropped GPS-guided bombs onto ISIS strongholds, launched long-range cruise missiles at fortified targets, and maintained constant air presence across multiple continents. And each decade brought something new. Engineers added satellite links, expanded electronic warfare suites, and integrated weapons racks designed for precision glide bombs and naval strike missiles. The B-52 became a floating arsenal, a sky platform capable of supporting ground troops, destroying infrastructure, or hitting high-value targets with pinpoint accuracy. But perhaps the greatest transformation of all is yet to come. As the aircraft approaches its 8th decade of service, the Air Force is preparing a new upgrade that will keep the B-52 flying well into the 2040s, nearly a century after its first flight. Its old, smoky Pratt & Whitney engines will be replaced with modern Rolls-Royce F-130 turbofans, giving the bomber more power, better fuel efficiency, and dramatically longer range. New digital cockpits will replace analog panels. New radar systems, capable of mapping terrain through clouds and weather, will be installed. And new weapon systems, including hypersonic missiles, will give the B-52 capabilities on par with aircraft half its age. The bomber that once carried gravity bombs is becoming a launch platform for next-generation weapons that travel 5 times the speed of sound. It is an astonishing evolution, a design born in the era of slide rules and drafting tables, now updated for a world of satellites, cyber warfare, and artificial intelligence. But what truly sets the B-52 apart is not technology, it is endurance. No bomber in history has flown so long, so far, or through so many conflicts. It patrolled during the darkest days of the Cold War. It fought in Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, and countless smaller missions in between. It served under 13 U.S. presidents, weathered every shift in military doctrine, and outlived nearly every aircraft ever built. Ask any veteran who worked with it, and you'll hear the same sentiment. The B-52 was overbuilt. That's why it survived. Its wings flex but never break. Its frame, strengthened for the nuclear age, can absorb stress that would cripple other bombers. Its systems are simple enough to repair, robust enough to customize, and spacious enough to evolve. And today, its role is changing yet again. The newest strategic doctrine envisions the B-52 not merely as a bomber, but as a global strike platform, a long-range multi-mission aircraft capable of launching missiles, carrying electronic warfare pods, deploying naval strike weapons, and coordinating with drones and satellites across the world. With new engines, new sensors, and new armaments, it is expected to remain lethal until at least 2050, almost 100 years after its introduction. Very few machines ever achieve such longevity. Even fewer do so while remaining operationally relevant. But the B-52 is not just an aircraft, it is a symbol of American resilience, of technological audacity, and of a nation's ability to adapt to challenges across generations. When it first lifted off in 1952, no one could imagine it would still be flying in the age of smartphones and space tourism. Yet here it is, still powerful, still respected, still feared. And somewhere right now, as you read these words, a B-52 is climbing through the clouds, its 8 engines thundering, its wings trembling with the same energy that once carried it into the height of the Cold War. Below it stretches a world transformed, but above, in the thin blue air, the Stratofortress continues its watch, just as it has for nearly a century. A machine built for a war that never happened, a warrior that fought in every conflict since, a legend that refuses to die.